What's the one thing that's kept humans from starving for thousands of years? Around 2000 BC, ancient Egyptians were already using clay pots to store food, kinda like our grandma's Tupperware.
Aha, Doodles.
Food preservation is basically a way to keep food from going bad. It involves processes that make food resistant to microorganism growth and slow the oxidation of fats, which is pretty important, considering that food preservation can reduce waste, decrease production costs, and improve food security and nutrition. Ancient Mesopotamians around 2000 BC were already using special methods to keep their food fresh. Pretty cool, right? The Sumerians, for instance, were masters of drying fish around 2500 BC, a clever trick to beat spoilage. Let's take ancient Egypt, for example. They used clay pots to store food, sealing them with beeswax. Imagine Imhotep, an Egyptian engineer, saying, "I just sealed this pot with beeswax, and it's still fresh after 6 months." Like ancient Egyptian nobles, they also cleverly used clay jars with tight lids to stash away food for months. In 2500 BC, in the city of Thebes, people were already preserving fish by drying it in the sun for 3 days. The Egyptians also developed a method called defrutum, a fruit syrup that helped preserve jams and fruits for months. Meanwhile, in ancient Rome, they were perfecting a preserving technique using salt and snow to chill their food. One method that comes to mind is smoking. Ancient cultures used smoking to preserve meat and fish. It not only helped keep the food fresh, but also added flavor. The process involved exposing the food to smoke from burning plants. This helped to dehydrate the food, making it harder for bacteria to grow. And as a bonus, smoking helped to preserve the nutrients in the food. The ancient Greeks, for instance, used to store their food in clay pots with narrow necks to keep air out. But it wasn't the only method used by ancient cultures. Take, for example, the ancient Mesopotamians. The Sumerians, in what's now Iraq, cleverly used clay jars to store food, kinda like our grandparents' jam jars. Like Imhotep, an Egyptian engineer who used pickling to preserve cucumbers. And in ancient India, they used a similar method to preserve dairy products. They used a method called lactic acid fermentation, which is like a natural fridge, to preserve milk and create yummy yogurt. It's crazy to think that, without this simple method, people like Gudea, a Sumerian king, wouldn't have had their favorite fermented dishes. In fact, the ancient Sumerians were so into fermentation that they even had a goddess, Ninkasi, dedicated to beer and brewing. They even created a 4,000-year-old recipe for beer, the hymn to Ninkasi, which is still studied by brewers today. The Sumerians even stored food in ceramic silos, kind of like ancient pantries. Take, for instance, the ancient Egyptians around 1200 BC. They dried fish and meat to preserve them for months. The Incas even used a technique called charqui to dry llama meat, like an ancient beef jerky. But what about freeze drying? They'd leave them out in the cold, dry air, and then store them for up to 2 years. And this method was so effective that it helped them survive harsh winters. In the Middle Ages, people used salt, sugar, and spices to preserve food. Like the poor soul John, who tried to preserve a whole pig with just a few pounds of salt. Much like medieval merchant Reginald de Fournier, who overspent on salt for his infamous spoiled pork debacle. Reginald's blunder led him to try other methods, like fermenting and smoking, which were already popular in ancient Rome and China. The spice trade played a huge role in food preservation, with spices like pepper and cinnamon being used to mask spoilage. The ancient Indians, for example, used a combo of yogurt and spices to preserve foods like meat and veggies pretty effectively. Ancient Greeks, meanwhile, were masters of dehydration, using the sun to dry fruits and meats. Pretty genius, right? Which changed food preservation forever. Meet Nicolas Appert, a French chef, who won a prize in 1809 for inventing canning. He preserved 100 jars of food and none spoiled. Nicolas Appert's success inspired a French chef who created frozen meat pies for Napoleon's army. Talk about a cool meal perk. By 1830, refrigerated ships were transporting food across the globe. And by the early 1900s, household refrigerators were a thing. Before then, people relied on iceboxes, like the one Thomas More patented in 1803, to keep their food from spoiling. But what about before refrigeration? Take poor Clifford, a chef in 19th century London. He used ancient Roman tricks like storing veggies in root cellars to keep them crunchy. Fred W. Wolfe invented the first home fridge in 1913, a total game changer. And by the 1950s, new methods like vacuum sealing and modified atmosphere packaging emerged. Today, we have high-pressure processing, which can preserve food without heat or chemicals. Now, companies like Hormel are using it to preserve foods like meats and juices. And the best part, we can enjoy fresh food all year round, thanks to these modern preservation methods. Now let's get real, folks, like our ancestors did, and talk specifics, like how refrigeration uses about 13% of a typical household's energy. The ancient Greeks used snow to chill their food, kinda like our ancestors' version of a fridge, but way more icy and impressive. And let's not forget about freezing, which can preserve food for months, but can also affect the texture. Curing, on the other hand, is a low-energy method, but it can be time-consuming and requires careful monitoring. Dehydration is another option, which can be cost-effective, but can also lead to nutrient loss. And then there's fermentation, which can create unique flavors, but can also be unpredictable. Just like a perfect recipe, ancient Egyptians used around 2,000 years ago a combo of drying and sealing to keep food fresh. The ancient Greeks even used a combo of honey and snow to preserve meat. Pretty cool trick, right? The Incas, meanwhile, froze dried potatoes to make a snack called chuño, which sounds like a crunchy, ancient granola bar, right? In Asia, they use fermentation to preserve foods like kimchi and miso. In Africa, they use dehydration to preserve meats and fruits. And in Latin America, they use a combination of curing and smoking to preserve meats. In ancient Egypt, they even used a method called desiccation to dry out foods like grains and dates. And the best part is, these methods have been passed down through generations. Ancient cultures like the Incas used freeze drying, kinda like putting your food in a super powerful food dehydrator. The Egyptians, for example, used natron, a natural salt, to dry out fish and meats for storage. Emerging trends and technologies are changing the game. For instance, nanotechnology can help create smarter packaging, and biotechnology is being used to develop new preservation methods. In 2020, a company in the US developed a method to preserve food using a combination of heat and pressure. This method can preserve food for up to 5 years without refrigeration. Ancient humans also used a technique called desiccation, where they dry food like fruits and meats to remove moisture. For example, a study found that using biotechnology to preserve food can reduce energy consumption by up to 30%. Now, let's time travel to ancient Mesopotamia, where they used special containers to keep food fresh around 2500 BC. In Mesopotamia, they stored food in clay pots sealed with olive oil, kinda like our grandma's secret ingredient. Well, it turns out that ancient humans used some pretty clever methods to keep their food fresh. They used things like curing, smoking, and dehydration to preserve their food. The ancient Romans, for instance, were masters of preserving meats with salt, and their methods still influence Italian curing today. For example, curing is still used to make foods like bacon and ham. Like the Incas, who freeze-dried potatoes to make a snack called chuño. The ancient Chinese, for instance, used ice houses to store food, kinda like our modern freezers, but made of ice and straw. Ancient Egyptians stored grains in clay silos, kinda like our modern pantries, but way cooler and underground.